Welcome to the Aconic Podcast with me, Soon Yu, your host. The Aconic Podcast features candid conversations with successful Asian and AAPI leaders who share their personal journeys of challenges and triumphs. The Aconic Podcast is brought to you by the Asian American Foundation, by Gold House, and by the founders of the Asian Alumni Chapter of the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and is made possible through the generous support of Altos Ventures, whose offices also serve as the home of the Aconic Podcast.
I've always wanted to meet the folks at KKR. It was a legendary firm. It had an amazing reputation. So I drove back down to New York from Boston, got to meet all the folks in our New York office on a Friday, including Henry Kravis, and we had a great conversation about classical music as well as finance. They put me on a plane that evening to California to meet George Roberts and all of our colleagues in Menlo Park, California. And by Monday morning, I had offered to join as an analyst and made the decision to pull out of HBS and join KKR.
Welcome to the Aconic Podcast. I'm really excited today to welcome our next guest, Joe Bae. Joe, welcome.
Soon, great to be here with you.
Well, we're very excited to have you because honestly, we would not be having any podcast without your efforts and your inspiration and honestly, your guidance. And so from my bottom of my heart, I'm very appreciative of the fact that we're able to do programs like this to be able to share stories of great iconic leaders like yourself. And for those of you who don't know Joe, which I'm sure there's very few people don't know Joe, but he's the CEO of KKR. And KKR is one of the most storied investment firms ever. You've been with the company for over 30 years, and the company has grown dramatically. I don't think it's reached $500 billion, but I don't think that's out of the question in the next year or two that you'll have $500 billion under management, which is an incredible number. It's the world's largest investment firm. And some things I think you are best known for is really leading and developing the APAC practice and growing that. And a couple other things that folks should know about that, again, to speak to the amazing accomplishments that you've had. You are one of the key founders of TAAF, the Asian American Foundation, one of the key partners and sponsors for this podcast. And also, you and your wife have contributed heavily to developing the Asian American Studies program at one of the most important universities to lead it at Harvard. And so these are all incredible accomplishments, but I'm sure they all started out probably at very humble beginnings, if I understand correctly, because you immigrated with your family at an early age. Is that right?
Soon, thank you very much. Just two quick corrections. I've been with KKR now for 28 years. So I joined back in 1996. And we actually manage around $575 billion today. So a little over $500 billion, but everything else was right on. But you're absolutely correct, Soon. You know, I'm a first generation Korean American. I was born in Seoul. My family, my parents and my two older brothers moved to the US back in 1974 when I was 2 years old. So, you know, we do come from relatively humble immigrant backgrounds. My dad was able to come over on a scientific visa. He's a chemist. And my mother is a social worker and Presbyterian minister.
Wow, that's an amazing background. And so you guys came over when you were 2 years old. I have a shared experience. I came over when I was 3 years old. And in some ways, I guess we are first generation, even though technically we're not. I definitely feel very first generation. And I understand that when you were growing up, you grew up in a neighborhood and in a school system where there weren't a lot of Asians. Is that right?
Yeah, when we first moved to New York, like many Korean immigrants, we started in Flushing in Queens for a couple of years. And then ultimately, because the public school systems were so much better out on Long Island, my family moved out to Long Island around 1976. And it was at that point in time a very, very pretty much an all-white community that we moved into, but with an excellent public school system. And, you know, we had a Korean church in the neighborhood where, you know, Koreans from all over Long Island would congregate on the weekends. But my hometown of East Northport, New York, had very, very few Asians.
Yeah, I was reading that you were, is it one of two Asians in your school at the time?
Yep. It was our music school teacher was the only Asian teacher in K through 12. And there was one other Asian student at that school.
That's amazing. Now, growing up both as an immigrant, growing up being really a minority in the school system, how has that sort of shaped who you are today?
Well, I think as first-gen immigrants, there was such a focus on integration and assimilation, right? In a weird way, my parents were more concerned with me and my brothers fitting in to the American society, American culture, versus teaching us to be more and more Korean, if you will. Which is strange given all the work now I'm doing for Asian American Studies and for TAAF. But honestly, the priority for that generation, my parents' generation, was to make sure we got an amazing education. They sacrificed basically everything to make sure my brothers and I had opportunities educationally to excel. And also to make sure we were able to adapt and fit into this very different culture in America. And I think that adaptability was a life skill that, quite frankly, has helped me in business. It's helped me in so many other settings in life.
That's so interesting that, I have to reflect back to when I came over when I was 3 and my parents, the calculus was different. It was really about, there aren't a lot of other role models to look at. So we had to become those role models. And obviously you've become one of the important role models for our community. But the process to get there took a lot of adaptability, which I think you speak to. What I think is really interesting is when I think about your background, your first love wasn't finance or it wasn't business. It was actually music. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I think my parents, like many, again, first generation parents, they really were very, very strong believers in education. But similarly, they thought excelling in something like a musical instrument was a key part of the stepping stones to get into the right college ultimately, et cetera. So my brothers and I were all very, very serious music students. My oldest brother played the violin, my middle brother played the cello, and I played the piano quite seriously growing up. And, honestly, I had dreamed at some point in junior high school that maybe I could actually become a musician, a classical pianist. But I think with a lot of people, whether you're an athlete or a musician, you kind of figure out at some point that you don't have enough talent to probably do that for the rest of your life. So, since college, I really haven't played much piano at all.
That's incredible. Well, instead of being on stage for music at the Lincoln Center, you're on stage probably for other reasons now. So that's still pretty amazing. And it's come full circle in different ways, which I think is very impressive. You relay a story about your dedication to music that actually is really about your father's dedication to music. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've told the story once or twice, but I think it gives you a sense for my parents' commitment to our collective success, me and my brothers. So my dad was a chemist. He was actually commuting from Long Island to Brooklyn for his job, which was a long commute each way. And for my piano lessons, he wanted to be in the room while I was actually taking the lessons every week. So my instruction would happen around 45 minutes away from my house. And it would be an evening piano class. So he'd come home from work after commuting back from Brooklyn. We'd eat dinner together as a family. And then he would personally drive me to my piano lesson like at 9 o'clock at night. And he would sit through it with a tape recorder. So he would record my piano lessons. And on the 45-minute drive back home, he would make me listen to the actual piano lesson with him and give me like commentary about like what I could be doing better and, where he saw opportunities to improve. But he was a very hands-on dad in that sense in terms of really commitment to my success.
Wow, that's such a powerful story on so many levels. One, the fact that your dad invested so much of his waking hours to help you with something that he deemed important for your success. I think that's incredible. The idea that there's no downtime. We got productivity issues here, so let's take advantage of it and be resourceful. I think that's incredible innovation and speaks to the idea of productivity. And lastly, it's just the idea that you and your dad got to spend a lot of time together on something that obviously you were working towards. And I'm sure that has probably left you with some important memories for you and as you think about raising family yourself.
Well, my wife and I have 4 kids, and ironically, none of them play any musical instruments. But I do think what we've said to our children is find something you're incredibly passionate about and go after that, whether that's sports, whether it's other forms of art. And I think that's really, for me, a key thing my parents also gave me is, to put in that kind of time and dedication as a child doing anything, it has to be something you actually really care a lot about and that you love doing. So for my kids, unfortunately, none of them have taken up musical instruments, but they have other passions, whether it's astrophysics for my oldest son, or track for my two younger kids, or wrestling. But it's been a great journey, and also being an active participant in those activities with them.
Wow, that's an important takeaway, this idea of finding something you're passionate about and then applying yourself to it to teach yourself dedication. But obviously, you don't want to dedicate yourself to something that you're not at all interested in. So I think that combination will allow us to learn that life lesson and the lesson of dedication. I think, so you've talked about adaptability and dedication. How have those sort of helped you in, I think, getting into Harvard? I mean, in some ways, getting into Harvard is that's a pretty amazing accomplishment. And so what was the road to try to actually get into Harvard as an undergrad?
Well, listen, I think, the first priority for my parents and for my brothers and I was obviously education. So working incredibly hard in high school, obviously with grades and with test scores, extracurriculars, music. I think that all paved the way for my application to college. But I think, the messaging when we were growing up was really about hard work, about sacrifice, about commitment. And what I've learned, I guess, over the last 30, 40 years as an adult is hard work is critical. It'll get you in the front door in places like college. It'll get you in the front door probably with an entry-level job, right? That commitment, that dedication. But it's not enough when you think about career progression over time. It's more than just hard work, right? It's about EQ. It's about teamwork. It's about leadership skills. And I think, those are some of the more nuanced messages that we're trying to teach our kids. You absolutely have to work hard, right? But long-term success is about more than just personal effort. It's about collective success, teamwork, and leadership.
These are really important lessons. And I think you mentioned how early on in high school, as most of us, we focused on our grades and, obviously having the right set of, I guess, activities for the colleges to sort of, take a notice. And I think you had mentioned that really working at KKR was a place where you gained a lot of mentorship. And I'm making an assumption here, but it sounds like a lot of these other so-called skills that you've been talking about, the EQ, the collective, that came from actually your experience working at KKR. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, when I joined finance back in 1996, right out of college, I did 2 years at Goldman, and then I came over to KKR. And there was very few Asians at that time. So the classical sense of mentorship by someone who looks like you or, similar to you, quite frankly, wasn't an option for me because there were very, very few senior Asians on Wall Street at that point in time. But at KKR, what I found was this extraordinary culture, a culture of collaboration, a culture of teamwork, and role models who really excelled at those skills. Great team leaders, people with great followership. And those are really the role models that I fashioned my own career at KKR, trying to emulate their behaviors, their values, their success.
What really struck me is that you were able to pick up on the idea of both mentorship and the type of mentorship you might get when you did a marathon interview to actually consider KKR. Can you talk a little bit about how you were actually sitting in a dormitory ready to start your first semester at HBS, whether it was HBS, and I think it was even Harvard Law, right? And you said, "To hell with Harvard." Well, explain how that all happened.
Not quite. But
okay, I embellished a little.
I was about to start Harvard Business School after my analyst program at Goldman Sachs. Had moved up there that summer, and classes were 2 weeks away, like 10 days away from starting.
2 weeks away. Wow.
And then I got a call from a headhunter in New York saying KKR is going to hire 2 analysts in New York this year or for the next year. Would you like to interview for one of the spots? And knowing my HBS classes were starting in 10 days, I said, okay, they're going to need to make a very quick decision if I go through with this interview process. And I've always wanted to meet the folks at KKR. It was a legendary firm. It had an amazing reputation. So I drove back down to New York from Boston, got to meet all the folks in our New York office on a Friday, including Henry Kravis, and we had a great conversation about classical music as well as finance. They put me on a plane that evening to California to meet George Roberts and all of our colleagues in Menlo Park, California. And by Monday morning, I had offered to join as an analyst and made the decision to pull out of HBS and join KKR.
I think if I was your folks, they might have been a little shocked at this type of decision, because I know my folks invested a lot for me to go to business school. I can't even imagine telling them I'm not going to business school.
Absolutely. For Korean American first generation immigrant parents, there is nothing more valuable than education and graduate degrees. So, we joke in our family that I'm the least educated of any of my siblings, and any of, my wife or my sister-in-laws all have graduate degrees. So, in a very funny way, I'm the least educated person in our family.
That's amazing. And further than that is obviously you've had great success. I'm not saying you're more successful than your brothers or sisters, but let's just say that hasn't held you back. That's fantastic. So talk about the early years of KKR. It looks like you got a lot of great mentorship. You were there for almost a decade before you decided to kind of pick up, and I wouldn't call it the wild, wild west, but it wasn't a very developed part of the business. You decided to go to Asia.
When I joined KKR back in 96, we were a small firm. We had around 25 investment professionals at the time. We were investing a $3 billion fund, which was a large pool of capital way back then in 1996, relative to we're a firm of 2,500 people today. And we manage $575 billion. So the scale of KKR in the last 28 years, the growth has been just incredible. A big part of that growth was our ability to continue to expand our business beyond our U.S. private equity business, our core business. So in the late 90s, our firm started expanding into the European market for private equity. And in 2005, we had never done business in Asia. We had no offices, no people in Asia. But quite frankly, you didn't need to be a rocket scientist to understand that Asia was going to be an incredibly dynamic part of the global economy. And as an investor, there would be incredible investment opportunities in that part of the world. And I saw myself at that moment in time saying, this is the opportunity for me to do something more entrepreneurial, to potentially make a really big impact for KKR. So I put my hand up and said, I'd really love this opportunity, really as a first-year partner to try to build a business for KKR in Asia. So my family and I moved to Hong Kong in 2005, and I spent the next 10 years building and scaling a large regional business across Asia, which today manages around $70 billion of assets. We have 9 offices across the region, and we're present in every major market in Asia today.
On the Aconic Podcast, we really celebrate the idea of the hero's journey. And fortunately for us, one of our partner organizations is at the forefront of celebrating our great heroes and their stories. And that organization we work with is Gold House. Gold House is a cultural ecosystem that unites, invests, and champions Asian Pacific leaders to power tomorrow for all of us. To learn more, please visit goldhouse.org.
For most of my life, I was not focused on AAPI issues, quite frankly. When I was in college, I was not part of the Asian Student Organization or the Korean Students organizations. That was not where I spent my time or what my community was in college, or quite frankly, when I came to Wall Street. I think the origin story of TAAF and my evolution in this area was really during the COVID period.
That's truly amazing that you were able to take something, be a catalyst, and then build a scalable platform. I think that's very much, I think a key characteristic in a lot of what you've done is this idea of being a catalyst and then building a platform from that action. And I think what was really interesting is when I looked at how you approached building the business, especially in Hong Kong, where there's such a strong expat community, and where there was at that time, I think in the early 2000s, still a tremendous respect for the idea of having expats in any type of global office. You decided that wasn't the strategy you guys wanted to pursue. Can you talk about this idea that you actually decided to go more local?
Yeah, I think from day one, our strong conviction was that to be successful in a place like Asia, we needed to have deep local connectivity in each of the markets and countries that we wanted to do business in. So we had our regional headquarters in Hong Kong with a lot of our administrative functions, finance, HR, technology, etc. But we very quickly localized our business to open offices in Beijing and Tokyo and Seoul and Mumbai, Singapore, Sydney, Australia. And our business today still is organized by country teams, right? I think we have 2 expatriates on the ground in Asia who are not locals out of 350 executives now on the ground in that region. So a big part of the strength, I think, of our business there is how deeply local we are and how connected we are to that marketplace, but operating in a truly global platform where we can leverage all the expertise, the people we have around the world, the capabilities we've built around the world to bring that advantage to the Asian market.
Yeah, in some ways, you've created local depth, but also lots of diversity by having that type of representation from each of those offices. That's truly amazing versus having one big office in Hong Kong where you sort of ran everything. This is really, truly a different strategy, and I think probably a key to one of your successes there. This idea that, you had the storied founders of KKR willing to sort of hand over the reins to you and obviously your co-CEO. What was that process like? And you broke the proverbial bamboo ceiling. Did you even think that you were doing that, or is it just something that happened naturally?
Well, listen, my partner, Scott Nuttall, who's my co-CEO, and we were the 2 analysts who joined in New York back in 1996. So I've spent my entire professional career at KKR working side by side with Scott. So our firm is a little bit unique in that we are strong believers in co-leadership. Henry Kravis and George Roberts are 2 of our 3 co-founders, are co-heads of our firm, right? And the co-chairman of KKR today. And that co-model, I think, is very atypical for most firms. It takes a tremendous amount of personal trust. It takes a tremendous amount of friendship between those individuals. And Scott and I have been working together literally for 28 years. We're great friends. Our families are very, very close with each other. We still go on vacations together, occasionally. So if you have that kind of chemistry, I think it's a really powerful approach to leadership because we can cover a lot more ground, right? With 2 people at the top, just given the scale and breadth of our business today. I didn't join KKR thinking one day I wanted to be CEO of KKR. I joined KKR wanting to learn how to invest, right? And really learn from the best there were in private equity. And I think a big part of the reason Scott and I were ultimately asked to take on these leadership roles is we had both independently, as part of our career at KKR, built big platforms within the firm. I had spent 10 years building out our Asia business, which is one of our most important franchises now. And my partner, Scott, had gone on, he had left the private equity business to build out our credit business, our insurance platform, our capital markets business. So he was also a business builder as well as an investor. And I think to lead an organization like KKR, being a strong investor is a table stakes, but to be a leader of the organization, you have to be a business builder. You have to be good at strategy, right? You got to be strategic in how you're trying to take your company to the next level. And I think Scott and I both had our opportunity to prove that, in different parts of the firm.
That's truly amazing that you 2 are role modeling a lot of the cultural values and tenets that you basically share throughout KKR, which is that of collaboration, partnership, trust, and this idea of working side by side with people you actually like, and it's not I guess Machiavellian. It's really something where you guys are trying to support each other. I also love this idea that one of the key success for both KKR, but also I think in general is this idea of building something, right? Building something that is meaningful. And for you was the idea of helping to globalize. And I think for Scott, it sounded like there was a lot of diversification of different, I guess, related businesses.
Yes.
And you add those 2, diversification of verticals married with globalization. Wow. I mean, that's a pretty 1 + 1 = 3 situation.
Absolutely. It's been an amazing growth trajectory for the firm.
So let's talk about this idea of building and being a catalyst, because I really feel like that's a big theme in your life, Joe. And one of the areas that's happened is with TAAF. And I believe that you and I had a pre-call, and you talked about being not as active in the AAPI community to now being one of the most active spokespersons we have, and being able to talk to not every single issue and where we're going, with authority. And so talk to me the journey, for your own personal journey, from sort of being less active with the AAPI community to being one of the key spokespeople. And then how did sort of TAAF get formed in that own personal journey that you had?
For most of my life, I was not focused on AAPI issues, quite frankly. When I was in college, I was not part of the Asian student organization or the Korean students organizations. That was not where I spent my time or what my community was in college, or quite frankly, when I came to Wall Street. I think the origin story of TAAF and my evolution in this area was really during the COVID period. When COVID hit, what we started to see was this extraordinary rise in Asian hate, in discrimination, and physical violence against the Asian community in the United States. It was the rhetoric that President Trump was using to a certain degree around the China flu, the virus, which unleashed a wave of this anti-Asian sentiment in the United States. So we actually got a call, me and some other friends of mine who are business leaders as well, who are Asian. We got a call from Jonathan Greenblatt at the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. They're one of the preeminent anti-hate organizations in the country. Their roots over 100 years ago started around anti-Semitism and fighting anti-Semitism in the U.S. for the Jewish community. But the ADL has broadened itself to really be one of the best anti-hate organizations in the world. So Jonathan called us up out of the blue, probably 6 or 7 of us, and said, listen, we track, online hate speech. We track physical violence of hate crimes. And we have never seen an explosion of anti-hate speech online in particular, like we're seeing during COVID for the Asian community. And it starts with online anti-hate speech, and ultimately it manifests itself into physical violence against that community. Like that's the pattern. So he was really calling us just to give us a heads up. This is happening. It's coming. And your community, the Asian American community, is not organized, has no infrastructure, if you will, national infrastructure to combat this trend. So you guys need to think about how the Asian community should respond to this emerging crisis. So this was July of 2020 during lockdown, where myself, Joe Bae, Jerry Yang, Peng Zhao, Li Lu, some of the most senior Asian American business leaders in finance and tech, they all came out to my summer home, and we spent 4 days together just brainstorming, talking to a lot of different experts, thinking about what could be done in this area. And out of those conversations emerged this idea of the Asian American Foundation. The Black community has the NAACP. The Jewish community has the ADL, right? The gay lesbian community has GLAAD. Our community is more complicated, right? There's so many different ethnicities that are Asian or Pacific Islander. They're very fragmented, right? The Koreans and the Chinese and the Indians and the Cambodians, they never really think about working together to exercise either political voice or influence in their communities. So there was a real opportunity, but a huge need within the Asian community to create some of that national infrastructure to start combating, the challenges we're facing. And as we got TAAF up and running, we spent the next couple of years, we're only 3 years old now as an organization, trying to really define what the priorities are for TAAF. Anti-hate is clearly one of them, but we very quickly understood that to really enhance a sense of belonging in this country, most Americans don't really understand the history of Asian Americans in America for the last 300 years, right? You're taught about the Civil War. You're taught about women's voting rights in the U.S. You're taught about a lot of these social movements that have made Americans stronger. Asian Americans have had their version of that for the last 250 years. You just never get taught that. So the second pillar was around education. K through 12 education in public schools, where AAPI curriculum is now included in 11 states in the United States. In just 3 years, there's been a lot of progress. We obviously want this to be taught in all 50 states in a substantive way. And then, as you mentioned earlier in this interview, at the higher education level, at the university level, where the scholarship, the academic research happens, AAPI studies is dramatically underrepresented in higher ed. And that's also something we're trying to address in terms of fundamental research and creating the opportunity for scholarship in this area. And then the third piece is really around narrative change, right? How Asian Americans are represented in America today, and representation in all fields, whether it's business, in media, in publishing, in a lot of different fields where Asian Americans do have that bamboo ceiling today. And then I think finally for us, the fourth pillar perhaps is the one that's going to be the most needle moving in the short term, is the Asian American community gets very, very little support from corporations and nonprofit foundations. Less than 0.5% of all of the giving, in terms of corporate philanthropy and foundation giving, goes to the Asian American community today in America. So there is a real blind spot in terms of what the needs are for the community and the under-resourcing and funding of the community. So those are the 4 pillars of TAAF that we ultimately agreed to lean into.
That's truly amazing where you guys have come together. And I suppose this is one of the best practices in terms of when you identify a gap, one of the first steps is building infrastructure. And for you talked a lot about this. And obviously I'm friends with a lot of the folks at TAAF, and you built incredible infrastructure in terms of hiring great people, focused on the 4 pillars that you talked about, which is really, anti-hate. You talked about education, narrative change, and lastly, this idea of how do we really, I think, improve giving within the community, right? And support within the community. And those are incredible pillars. And so I'm curious, as you guys were part of, infrastructure is not cheap, right? It costs money. And so as you guys were going out and trying to figure out how to pay for this infrastructure, you went to talk to a lot of corporations, I'm sure, right? People that you've done business with or did business with you. In those conversations, did you find that, what surprised you and why wasn't it already happening?
I think it's a combination of reasons. So when we first started TAAF, our founding partners at TAAF, the individuals I mentioned, myself and a couple of others, from day one, we said, listen, this is a new organization. The founding partners here will cover the overhead of TAAF in terms of running TAAF, the people costs, the overhead, the offices, et cetera. But for us to achieve our mission, we're going to need much broader support within our community. That's other donors, that's foundations, that's corporate giving, government programs, et cetera. So when we launched in our first year, we pivoted not to try to raise money for TAAF itself, but we said the focus really ought to be how do we create greater resources for the Asian American community. So they don't need to give money to TAAF, but we want more resources to flow to other community organizations, other Asian American priorities. So when we were out there talking to CEOs, I think most CEOs, quite frankly, want to do the right thing. They have very robust community engagement programs. They have very robust corporate philanthropy programs. They support many organizations, in the Black community, in the gay lesbian community, in the women's issues. So there's a lot of corporate giving that's happening. It's just not flowing to the AAPI community. And a big part of that is they're not scaled national organizations to support. So one of the things we kept hearing is we don't know who to give the money to, right? There's small community organizations that are very fractured in each of the cities, serving very narrow Asian communities, right? So I think part of it was it's difficult to think about scaled giving to Asian American causes today. And TAAF was, I think, a different kind of organization. The second thing we were struck by is there was really no understanding of what the needs of the community were, right? This notion of this model minority myth, the Asian community is doing fine, right? High education levels, right? good representation in great colleges, well represented in elite jobs, doctors, lawyers. Wall Street now has high Asian American representation. So there was this image that the Asian American community didn't need a lot of help, which is far, far from the truth. Our community, the Asian American community in America, has, the leading cause of death in the Asian American community for youth is suicide. It's not drug use, it's not car accidents, it's suicide. There's a massive mental health issue that's prevalent across our community. When you think about the percentage of elderly that live in poverty, the Asian American community here in New York City, my hometown, it's the highest rate of elderly poverty. It's not the Black community or Hispanic community. It's the Asian American community in New York City. When you think just about resources to fight issues like anti-hate, very, very little funding coming to the community. So a lot of the work we were doing in the first year of TAAF, when we were talking to companies and foundations and other philanthropists, we're just trying to educate people and break this model minority myth, right? This understanding that there's actually really significant needs in the community that are not being addressed today. And once they understood that, they instinctually understood that they have a lot of Asian Americans working in their companies, right? If any Wall Street bank, you're going to have a huge Asian American population. KKR, we have a huge Asian American population. But once you understand that there's also massive need in that community broadly, you want to do the right thing and you want to get engaged and you want to make sure you're not only taking care of your people, but you're taking care of your community as well.
During the height of the Asian hate crimes, I was left with a sense of disbelief and anger. These feelings prompted me to write a Forbes article titled, "Who Owns the AAPI Brand?" It's clear that branding such a diverse community is difficult. Yet in the absence of a cohesive brand narrative, derogatory stereotypes and racial slurs were created. Fortunately, the AAPI community did come together and form TAAF, the Asian American Foundation, to not only combat Asian hate, but to also share positive narratives that fight bias and promote belonging. TAAF has launched numerous programs to support this effort, including the Aconic Podcast. Please visit taaf.org to learn more, and to subscribe to this podcast, please visit aconicpodcast.com. Join me in supporting TAAF, because together we make a difference.
That's truly amazing, being able to have those conversations and use that as sort of formative to how you guys organize TAAF. And this idea that everyone has the right intentions, but they, probably don't think based on those right intentions that our community actually needs any of their help, right? And then once they realize, oh no, actually not only does this community need help, actually a lot of my employee base is actually part of this community. What do I do with that? Well, we need a vehicle for that. And that's sort of where TAAF was born, which is an amazing sort of congruence of all those sort of factors that you guys thought about in terms of developing TAAF. As you think about TAAF for the next 3 to 5 years, sort of what's next and what is it that you're most excited about in terms of what TAAF is trying to tackle?
Yeah, so I think in each of the pillars, we have some pretty important initiatives, but this notion of unlocking resources for the broader community is, again, one of my highest priorities personally. When we launched TAAF, we launched something called the TAAF Giving Challenge. So again, we went out to all these different stakeholders and said, our community is underfunded. We're not asking you necessarily to give money to TAAF, but we want you to make a pledge that in the next 5 years, you're going to allocate a certain amount of resourcing and giving to the Asian American community, whatever the organization is or cause is. And we were able to circle around $1.1 billion of commitments from our corporate partners, other foundations, and philanthropists, that in the first 5 years, they would spend a minimum collectively of $1.1 billion. And some of that obviously came to TAAF, but the vast majority was going to other areas of need in the Asian community. That was version 1.0, right? This was before we had defined the 4 pillars, before we had defined the specific use case. And in the first 3 years now of our existence, $1.8 billion has already been spent by our partners supporting the Asian community, right? The pledge initially was $1.1 billion over 5 years. but 1.8 billion has already been spent supporting the community. So I think there's a lot more to go in terms of engagement with donors, engagement with corporations and foundations and philanthropists to unlock even more resources for Asian American organizations across the country. Education, I think, is pretty straightforward. We want to keep pushing public education K through 12 to include Asian American studies and continue to make progress school by school in higher education to make sure that's a real discipline that's being researched and taught to undergrads. In terms of anti-hate, we have a pretty ambitious program. We want to create local networks in big metropolitan areas. So New York City, for instance, TAAF is leading a coalition of Asian American organizations in New York to address anti-hate locally in the city, right? Different community organizations, counseling, engagement with law enforcement, but really in a targeted effort around New York City. There are 28 cities that we want to build these action networks in that cover around 90% of the Asian population in America today. So in the next 5 years, that's what we're building towards in terms of anti-hate. And then in terms of narrative change and representation, it runs the spectrum, whether it's in terms of entertainment industries, celebrating our successes. It's really been this incredible period of growth for Asian American representation in film and television. Representation of senior Asians in corporate boardrooms, in the C-suite of companies, making sure there's a real focus on that. And also the narrative around this model minority myth, right? Being able to accurately portray the facts. So we did a survey this past year in New York City for the first time on sentiments among Asian Americans living in the city. And the numbers are pretty shocking. Over 50% of the people surveyed in the 5 boroughs in New York, Asian Americans that were surveyed, said that they had either been verbally or physically attacked in the last 12 months. I don't think most people understand what our community is dealing with right now. So we're trying to lead with facts, actual data, surveys to put out there in the marketplace so people understand the magnitude of the issue, but also feel the urgency of needing to get involved.
Listening to what's ahead for TAAF, I'm struck by 2 things. First is how much has already been accomplished in just 3 years. The amount of giving, the infrastructure that's been built, the 4 pillars and the programs that have been sort of initiated just in 3 years. But I'm also struck by the fact that it's just the tip of the iceberg, right? In terms of giving, in terms of changing how we are educated and our kids are educated about the role that Asian Americans have had in history, changing the narrative. I mean, this whole podcast was one of those initiatives to really help share new narratives about, our leaders. And so there's still more work to be done, I guess. But at the same time, I'm so encouraged by what's been done in 3 years. And that's very exciting. So, Joe, you've had an incredible, I think, success in terms of both career, personal, and I'm sure there's probably things that if you look back and said, if I could tell myself this when I was 20 or 25 or when I was just starting out, I might share these 2 or 3 things with myself or maybe even with your kids. What might those things be that our audience could benefit from?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, one of the things that I'm a little embarrassed about for myself is how little I actually knew about Asian American history, like what we're trying to get included in curriculum, right? You knew the obvious things about the Japanese internment, right, and things like that. But the depth and the richness of the Asian American experience for the last 300 years is quite profound. And by different communities, the Filipino community, Chinese community. When you think about some of the biggest debates we've had in America around immigration, the China Exclusion Act it's one of the most discriminatory things ever, passed into law in America, targeting Chinese immigrants, but all Asians at that point in time. When you think about thorny topics like school segregation, which was rampant in the South with blacks and whites, at the same time in California, Asians were being segregated in public schools from whites, right? So you never hear about those issues, but a lot of the challenges that America's been through has also been experienced and sometimes led by the Asian community. So one thing I would recommend is learn your history. Really understand the collective experience of Asian Americans in this country to really understand where we are at this moment in time and what the path forward could be into the future. And then the second piece of advice is something I touched on briefly. I mentor a lot of young people here at KKR, a lot of Asian Americans who are in our ERG. And the message I consistently give them is this message around, it's not just the hard work. It's not just the individual hours you're putting in and the commitment. For you to really advance both in society, at the firm, and in life, it's about some of these softer skills, right? The EQ, the empathy, the teamwork, the collaboration. Those are the skills you need to master, right? The more senior you get in the organization. And I wish my parents had taught me that too, when I was growing up. They were very much leaning into the hard work. You gotta outperform, outcompete, and not really telling me, this whole collaboration teamwork message, which I think would have been great growing up as well.
Well, I know you're putting your advice into action, especially on the first one. You're really, if I said to my child, hey, you got to get educated on Asian American, history, I think it'd be independent studies, right? It would be something where you'd have to sort of go to the library, go online, kind of research on your own, and hopefully get credible sources. And I think obviously that's changing now with your investment in Asian American studies, and hopefully that will have a cascade and ripple effect throughout other programs, which is fantastic. Your second piece of advice, which is growing up, I think, we're only taught half the equation. In fact, in many ways, as you get older, that half of the equation gets less and less important, and the other half becomes incredibly more important. The idea of people skills, the idea of relationships, and in some ways, I feel the U.S. versus other countries is a little over-torqued on the idea of sports, but there is one benefit to team sports in that in some instances, you are taught the idea of how to get along with others in a situation where you're all trying to accomplish the same goal, and you might have to play different roles. And how do you actually get things done through influence, not just by pure authority? And so I'm so encouraged by all the action that TAAF is taking on both those levels, right? Both building the infrastructure and the education, but the changing of the narratives also. We're being able to hear stories about how we are using our soft skills to become more successful, more influential. And it's something obviously that you've used to great extent to be where you are at KKR. Joe, I don't want to close just yet because I want to have some fun here, but I understand that you like milkshakes, karaoke, and poetry. Explain how those all sort of fit together in terms of shaping your sort of full-rounded self here.
Well, let me just explain where that came from. So when my wife and I got married, we got married very young at the age of 24. We were college sweethearts at Harvard College. We had our weddings in the New York Times. They did a little blurb about us, and they interviewed a bunch of my friends and her friends. And somehow it got into this wedding column that I like milkshakes and all the things you mentioned, which quite frankly, I would have never said because I don't actually like milkshakes very much.
Okay,
but
got
my
it.
friends thought I did.
Clearing that up. Good.
That's where a lot of that. Karaoke, maybe. I could probably get behind the karaoke.
Okay. Is there like a bootleg video of you singing somewhere on YouTube?
Well, if you live and do business in Asia for a decade, there was plenty of karaoke, but nothing recorded.
Got it. Okay, fantastic. We always end by asking our iconic guests, are there other iconic leaders that they would actually love to invite to our show? And we will do our best to go out and get them. But somebody that you think the listeners would really value from their story?
Obviously, we have some amazing leaders on the board of TAAF, the founders of TAAF. That would be amazing, I think, to do a podcast with. At this moment in time, I can't think of a higher profile founder, CEO than Jensen Huang at NVIDIA. So if you can get him on your program, I think people would be thrilled as well.
Okay. I'm sure there'll be a couple other guests that also say that. So we'll get a resounding chorus, and then I'll have the video and the audio and just be able to present it to Jensen. We'll get him on. Okay, great. Joe, thank you so much for your time and for giving back to the community in all the ways that you do. I really very much appreciated the deep insights and you opening up about, growing up and how you are leading KKR so differently. But most importantly, I think the future is so bright with what you guys have done with TAAF and where it's going. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for your time.
Listen to all episodes of Aconic on aconicpodcast.com. You can also catch new episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.